Death row has saved my life. I think that if I wouldn't have never came to death row, I wouldn't be the individual I am today. I wouldn't be as mature. I wouldn't be able to explain to my daughter's life, like the appreciation of it, because I didn't have any appreciation for life. I wouldn't be able to explain to them that there's a world out there and not just a city, you know. I wouldn't be able to do any of that without death row. I wouldn't be, I don't think I would have gotten over my anger. I would probably be in prison anyway. I would probably be dead. And so I really think that the chances were high I would be dead because of the gang activity I was into. And so, yeah, I look at death row as saving my life. And I'm actually happy I came here first because, like, the person I am today, I'm really, really satisfied with. You know, still a lot of growth, but I'm really satisfied with it. Growing up where I grew up at, prison that's where you're going. And we look to go to prison. And it's kind of like, gives you a stripe, gives you some credibility. And so because I have that, I can talk to boys, get their ear, and then take them away from it. You know, take them away from the path they're on, put them on a good path.
I tasted in my throat. Those were the last words a 34-year-old man spoke before he died in a Texas execution chamber. And according to doctors, those 4 words revealed the horrifying truth about what lethal injection actually does to your body. It feels like drowning from the inside while you're completely paralyzed and unable to scream. But here's what makes this case absolutely insane. The man who was executed wasn't even the same person who committed the crime 14 years earlier. He had completely transformed himself. He became a mentor, saved lives in prison, and stopped violent attacks. And get this, the son of the man he killed literally begged the state of Texas not to execute him. Let that sink in. The victim's son said, "Please don't kill this man." And they did it anyway. This is the story of Christopher Young, and by the end of this, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about justice, redemption, and whether our system actually cares about either one. Welcome to Deadline Files. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means a great deal, and it keeps these important stories alive. Because what happened here is going to make you uncomfortable, and it should. Let's start with what Christopher Young did, because we can't talk about redemption without first confronting the terrible act that put him on death row. In 2004, Christopher Young was 21 years old, living in San Antonio, caught up in gang life and making the worst decisions of his life. He walked into a convenience store owned by a man named Hasmukh Patel. Everyone called him Hash. He was a beloved husband and father, known throughout his community for his kindness and generosity. The kind of man who would help anyone who needed it. But on that day, Hash Patel never made it home. During a robbery, Christopher Young shot and killed him. A good man just trying to provide for his family was suddenly gone. His wife became a widow. His children lost their father. An entire community mourned. Christopher Young was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. The prosecutors painted him as a violent gang member, reckless and beyond saving. At the time, it seemed straightforward. He had committed a terrible crime, and he would pay the ultimate price. Just another name that would be added to the long list of people executed by the state of Texas. For years, that's exactly what it looked like. Another statistic. Another life that would end in that death chamber in Huntsville. But then something happened that nobody expected. Something that would turn this case into one of the most controversial executions in modern Texas history. Inside those prison walls, Christopher Young started to change. Not the fake kind of change where someone says they're sorry just to avoid punishment. Real, documented, undeniable change that even the guards and prison staff couldn't ignore. Young began to confront his past in a way that most people never do, even outside of prison. He started examining the life that had led him to that moment in the convenience store. He opened up about his childhood, the trauma, the gang violence, the poverty, the lack of opportunities, the terrible circumstances that had shaped him into someone capable of taking another person's life. And here's what's important. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame his upbringing or his environment or try to shift responsibility away from himself. He owned what he had done. He acknowledged that regardless of his circumstances, he had made a choice that destroyed a family and took an innocent life. But then he did something remarkable. He decided to make sure other young people didn't follow the same path. He wanted his life to stand as a warning, not an example. He wanted kids growing up in similar situations to see where that road ends and choose differently. Death Row started allowing youth outreach programs, where troubled teenagers would visit and hear from inmates about the consequences of their choices. Christopher Young became one of the most powerful voices in those programs. He would look these kids in the eye and tell them, "Don't be like me. Don't make the mistakes I made. Your life can be different." And the impact was real. Letters from young people who met him talked about how his words changed their perspective, how seeing where gang life and violence actually leads made them reconsider their choices. Teachers and counselors who brought groups to these sessions specifically requested Christopher Young because they saw how effectively he could reach kids who had tuned everyone else out. This wasn't some performative act for the cameras or the courts. Death row inmates don't get extra privileges for good behavior. They're already at the end of the line. Young wasn't doing this to get out or reduce his sentence. He was doing it because he genuinely wanted to prevent other families from experiencing what the Patels had experienced, from losing someone they loved to senseless violence. But it wasn't just talk with at-risk youth. Inside the prison itself, Christopher Young became known as a peacemaker in an environment where violence is currency and showing weakness can get you killed. In a place where racial tensions run high and violence erupts over the smallest perceived disrespect, he was the guy who would step between inmates and break up fights before they escalated into something deadly. Think about how difficult that is. Death row isn't like regular prison. These are people who have already been given the ultimate punishment. Many have nothing left to lose. The normal social calculations that might make someone think twice about violence, about facing additional time, about losing privileges, don't apply when you're already scheduled to die. Yet somehow, Christopher Young managed to become a voice of reason in that chaos. Prison guards, the people who see everything, who witness the worst of human behavior every single day, who have every reason to be cynical about inmates and their motives. These same guards described him as someone who genuinely tried to make the environment safer for everyone, not just for himself, but for other inmates and for the staff. There's a documented case where Christopher Young stopped another inmate from attempting suicide. He noticed the warning signs that others might have missed or ignored, and he talked the man down. He spent hours sitting with this person, convincing them that even on death row, even in the worst circumstances imaginable, life still had meaning. He pulled him back from the edge and literally saved his life. Let that irony sink in for a moment. A man on death row, waiting for the state to kill him, waiting for his own execution date to arrive, chose to save someone else's life. He could have looked the other way. He could have decided it wasn't his problem. But instead, he intervened and gave another person a reason to keep living even when his own life was measured in the time remaining until his execution. And it gets even more incredible. There was an incident where an inmate tried to attack a guard, one of the most serious violations that can happen in a prison. Christopher Young saw it happening and intervened. He put himself between the attacker and the guard, putting himself at physical risk to protect someone whose literal job it was to keep him locked up and isolated. Someone who represented the system that was going to kill him. Think about what that says about who he had become. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about sides or us versus them. He saw a human being in danger and acted to protect them, despite everything. In the darkest, most hopeless place in the American criminal justice system, Christopher Young found a way to become a source of light. He became the person who made death row a little bit safer, a little bit more humane. But here's the devastating question that hangs over this entire story. Would any of that transformation actually matter to the system that had already decided he would die? The answer came from the most unexpected place imaginable. Mitesh Patel, the son of the man Christopher Young had killed, did something almost unthinkable. Instead of demanding that Young be executed, instead of wanting revenge for his father's death, Mitesh asked the state of Texas to show mercy. Let that sink in for a moment. The victim's son, the person who had every right to want justice in its most final form, said, "Don't kill this man." Mitesh didn't just make a statement from far away or send a letter through his lawyer. He actually went to the prison and met Christopher Young face to face. Can you imagine how difficult that must have been? To sit across from the person who killed your father? To look into the eyes of someone who destroyed your family and changed your life forever? They sat separated by glass, and they talked. It wasn't a quick conversation or a formality. Mitesh came prepared to really see who Christopher Young had become. He asked questions. He listened. He tried to understand how the scared 21-year-old gang member had evolved into the person sitting in front of him. And in that conversation, something shifted in Mitesh's understanding of justice. He later described not seeing the reckless young man who had burst into his father's store with a gun. He saw someone carrying the full weight of what he had done, someone who had spent 14 years thinking about that moment and trying to become someone different. Someone who would never get the chance to apologize to Hash Patel directly, but who was spending every day trying to prevent other families from experiencing that same loss. So Mitesh Patel did something extraordinary that most people couldn't imagine doing. He went to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and pleaded with them directly. Commute the sentence to life in prison, he asked. Let this man live. Let him continue the work he's doing. Let him keep mentoring kids and saving lives behind bars. Let him spend the rest of his life making amends in the only way he can. Mitesh wasn't naive about what had happened. He wasn't minimizing his father's death or pretending that Christopher Young was innocent. He was saying something much more profound, that killing Young wouldn't bring his father back, wouldn't heal his family's pain, wouldn't accomplish anything except creating more death and more grief for Young's family. In most people's minds, if anyone has the right to decide whether someone lives or dies, it's the victim's family. They're the ones who lost someone they loved. They're the ones who live with that absence every single day, who see the empty chair at holidays and birthdays, who carry the weight of that loss forever. And here was Mitesh Patel, carrying all of that pain, saying, killing Christopher Young won't make anything better. Mercy is the answer. Letting him live and continue his work is the answer. It was one of the most powerful statements about justice and forgiveness that anyone involved in the criminal justice system had ever witnessed. Here was a victim's family member not seeking vengeance, but seeking meaning, seeking a way forward that honored his father's memory without requiring another death. But here's where the story gets even darker. In Texas, clemency, the power to reduce a death sentence, is incredibly rare. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles has the authority to recommend clemency to the governor, but they almost never do it. Since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, Texas has executed over 570 people. Guess how many times the board has recommended clemency? You can count them on one hand. When Christopher Young's case came before them, with Mitesh Patel's emotional plea for mercy, with documented evidence of Young's transformation, with letters from prison staff vouching for his character, with everything that should make a case for clemency compelling, the board voted 6-0 against clemency. No explanation, no reasoning, no acknowledgement of Young's transformation or the victim's son's wishes. No recognition that this case was different, that something extraordinary had happened here. Just silence and a decision that said, none of this matters. The execution will proceed as scheduled. The board didn't have to explain why Mitesh Patel's plea didn't matter. They didn't have to justify why 14 years of documented change meant nothing. They didn't have to address why preventing future violence through Young's mentorship was less important than carrying out the sentence. They just said no, filed the paperwork, and moved on. Mitesh Patel later said something that should haunt everyone involved in that decision. This was not about forgiveness alone. It was about justice. And justice should mean more than death. He was saying that true justice should consider the totality of circumstances, should weigh transformation and remorse, should listen when victims' families speak. But his voice, the voice that should have mattered most, was simply ignored. But Texas had made its choice. The execution was going forward, regardless of who asked them to stop it. And this wasn't the first time serious questions were raised about how Texas decides who gets mercy and who doesn't. Just months before Christopher Young's execution, another Texas inmate named Thomas Whitaker was scheduled to die. Whitaker was a white man who had orchestrated the murder of his own mother and brother in a plot to inherit the family fortune. His father, Kent Whitaker, the sole survivor of the attack, begged Texas to spare his son's life. He wrote letters, gave interviews, made personal appeals to anyone who would listen. And you know what happened? Texas listened. The governor granted clemency just hours before the scheduled execution. Thomas Whitaker's sentence was commuted to life in prison. The system that almost never shows mercy decided that in this case, the father's plea mattered, that his forgiveness and his desire to save his son's life was worthy of consideration. Now contrast that with Christopher Young's case. A black man with the victim's family begging for mercy, with documented evidence of profound transformation, with prison staff vouching for his character, with young people testifying that he had changed their lives and steered them away from violence. And his plea was denied without explanation, without even the courtesy of a reason why his case was different from Whitaker's. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Both cases involved heinous crimes. Both cases involved family members of victims making passionate pleas for mercy. Both cases involved inmates who had spent years on death row. But one man was granted clemency and one was executed. A federal judge named Keith Ellison actually criticized the entire clemency process in Texas, calling it well-nigh impossible to challenge. In Texas, clemency decisions are often made by facts. There are no public hearings. No one has to explain their reasoning. No transparency whatsoever. So here's the uncomfortable question we have to ask. Did race play a role in who was spared and who was executed? When the circumstances are so similar, when both cases involved family members begging for mercy, why did one man get to live and another had to die? There's no clear answer, and that's exactly the problem. When a system operates in complete secrecy, when no one has to explain their decisions, we're left to wonder whether justice is truly blind or whether some lives are simply valued more than others. On July 17, 2018, Christopher Young woke up knowing it was his last day on earth. He knew that in a few hours, the state of Texas would strap him to a gurney and inject chemicals into his body until his heart stopped beating. There would be no last meal request because Texas abolished that tradition back in 2011. Instead, Young ate the same standard prison tray that every other inmate got that day. Nothing special. Nothing to mark the occasion as different from any other day, except that it would be his last. At 6:13 in the evening, Christopher Young was led into the death chamber at Huntsville. This is the room where Texas carries out all of its executions. It's small, clinical, designed to look medical and humane. Witnesses sat behind glass windows, some from the victim's family, some from Young's family, reporters, prison officials, all watching as he was strapped to a gurney. His arms were extended out to the sides, making his body form a cross shape. IVs were inserted into his veins. And then came the moment for final words. Christopher Young turned his head toward where the Patel family sat and said, "I love y'all like they love me. Make sure the kids keep this fight going. I'm good, Warden." And then he said something that no one in that room would ever forget. "I tasted in my throat," for words that revealed something horrifying about how lethal injection actually works. Medical experts who study executions say that when an inmate describes a burning sensation or says they can taste something, it's likely a symptom of pulmonary edema, fluid flooding into the lungs as the drugs take effect. Here's what's actually happening. The execution protocol uses a 3-drug cocktail. The first drug is supposed to render you unconscious. The second drug paralyzes your entire body, including your respiratory muscles. The third drug stops your heart. But here's the nightmare scenario that experts say happens more often than we'd like to admit. What if the first drug doesn't work properly? What if you're not actually unconscious, but you're completely paralyzed and can't move or scream or let anyone know that you're aware of what's happening? The paralytic drug doesn't just stop you from moving. It stops you from breathing. Your lungs begin to fill with fluid. You feel like you're drowning, suffocating from the inside. But you can't gasp for air. You can't cough. You can't do anything except experience every second of it while appearing peaceful and still to everyone watching. When Christopher Young said, "I tasted in my throat," medical experts believe he was describing exactly that sensation. The feeling of drowning while being completely unable to fight it. His body's final, desperate attempt to communicate what was happening to him. It took several minutes for Christopher Young to be pronounced dead. Several minutes of lying there, strapped down, while whatever he was experiencing ran its course. And then it was over. The state of Texas had carried out its sentence. Justice, according to the law, had been served. But had it really? Let's be absolutely clear about something. Christopher Young was guilty of murder. He took the life of an innocent man. Hasmukh Patel didn't deserve to die, and his family didn't deserve to lose him. That's an undeniable truth that we can't and shouldn't minimize. But here's what makes this case so complicated, so troubling, and so important to talk about. Christopher Young in 2018 was not the same person as Christopher Young in 2004. On death row, he became a mentor who steered kids away from the path he had taken. He became a peacemaker who prevented violence. He became someone who saved lives, including the life of a prison guard. And the son of the man he killed looked at that transformation and said it mattered. Mitesh Patel believed that killing Christopher Young wouldn't serve justice. It would just create more death, more pain, more loss for another family. Yet none of that mattered to the state of Texas. Not the transformation. Not the mercy plea from the victim's family. Not the questions about racial disparities in who gets clemency. Not the concerns about whether lethal injection is actually the humane method of execution it's presented as. The system had made its decision 14 years earlier, and nothing. Not evidence of change, not pleas for mercy, not moral questions about the process itself. would alter that course. So we're left with the hard questions that this case forces us to confront. Should transformation matter in our justice system? If someone genuinely changes, if they become a force for good even in the worst circumstances, does that count for anything? Or is the worst thing you've ever done the only thing that defines you forever? Should the victim's family have the final say in punishment? We often talk about justice being for the victims, but what happens when the victim's family asks for mercy instead of death? Do we listen to them, or do we say the state's desire for retribution matters more? And when we're executing people in a way that might cause them to feel like they're suffocating while being unable to cry out, can we really call that humane? Is that the kind of justice we want to be known for? Christopher Young's case doesn't have easy answers. It's messy and complicated and forces us to grapple with the tension between punishment and redemption, between justice and mercy, between the person someone was and the person they became. What happened in that Texas death chamber in 2018 was legal. It followed all the rules. But legality and morality aren't always the same thing. And sometimes the cases that follow the rules most carefully are the ones that should make us question whether the rules themselves are right. The truth is, our criminal justice system isn't designed to handle stories like Christopher Young's. It's built on the idea that crimes deserve punishment, that actions have consequences, that society needs to be protected. And all of that is true and necessary. But it's not built to recognize transformation. It's not built to weigh the person someone has become against the crime they committed. It's not built to give weight to mercy when the victim's family asks for it. And it's definitely not built to question whether the methods we use to carry out ultimate punishment are actually as painless and dignified as we pretend they are. Maybe that's the real question Christopher Young's case leaves us with. Not whether he should have been executed, but whether we're comfortable with a system that can't or won't consider anything beyond the crime itself. Because if redemption is possible, if people can truly change, if mercy has any place in justice, then what happened to Christopher Young should trouble us deeply. And if we believe that none of those things matter, that the crime is all that counts regardless of anything that comes after, then we need to be honest with ourselves about what that says about our values as a society. Christopher Young's story ended in that death chamber. But the questions his case raises are still alive, still unresolved, still demanding that we figure out what justice really means and whether the system we have actually delivers it.